It was a night shrouded in shadows when the unthinkable happened. In the silence of an empty mansion, a body was found, cold, lifeless, and clutching a photograph that held secrets darker than death itself. But here's the twist. The woman everyone believed to be dead was alive, and the real killer, still out there playing a dangerous game with the truth. A complaint, Sir Henry. The words slipped out softly, yet they carried an air of challenge. The company fell into silence. Colonel Bantry, sprawled in his chair with his legs stretched lazily before him, fixed his gaze on the mantelpiece, as though it held a secret he was yet to uncover. His wife, on the other hand, was buried in the catalogue of bulbs, the crinkling paper betraying her interest in anything but the conversation. Dr. Lloyd, with a kind expression, was admiring Jane Helia, the actress whose beauty seemed to captivate every room she entered. Jane, meanwhile, appeared lost in thought, her fingers tracing the surface of her glass as though searching for answers. The only one unaffected by the seemingly light-hearted atmosphere was Miss Marple, sitting upright in her chair. Her faded blue eyes met Sir Henry's with a glint that spoke of secrets untold. "I protest," she said, her voice sharp, "on behalf of the silent few, the men. We've been listening to 3 stories told by men, but no woman has yet spoken. Is this some kind of conspiracy?" "Oh, Miss Marple, don't be so dramatic," Mrs. Bantry interrupted, a slight flush to her cheeks. "We've been good listeners, quietly absorbing the tales with all the appreciation one could offer. We've maintained the decorum of not thrusting ourselves into the spotlight." Sir Henry's eyes twinkled knowingly. "It's a fair excuse, but it won't do, and in fact, there's an excellent precedent for it in the Arabian Nights," he teased, urging, "Come now, ladies, surely one of you has a mystery to share." "Me?" Mrs. Bantry gasped. "I don't know any mystery, Sir Henry. I've never encountered bloodshed or secrets." "I don't demand blood," Sir Henry chuckled, but he leaned forward, his voice growing serious. "But a mystery, I'm sure. Miss Marple, perhaps. The curious case of the missing candle or something far more intriguing." Miss Marple, ever the enigma herself, gave a slow shake of her head. "Nothing that would interest you, Sir Henry. We have our little mysteries here, of course, but nothing as dramatic as you might imagine. There was the case of the missing shrimp last summer. It was trivial, really, though it did cast a light on human nature." Sir Henry's face darkened with mock seriousness. "Human nature. You've taught me a great deal about that, Miss Marple. Now, Jane," he turned to the actress, "surely you have something more daring, even." Jane stared into the distance, her eyes momentarily clouded with indecision. Nothing quite like what you're thinking," she murmured. "There were flowers, strange notes, but that's all. Just men, really, with their tricks. But as for real mystery..." A pause lingered, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally Jane's voice broke the silence. "Wait, I do remember something, not an incident, more of a tragedy, one that involves betrayal, and something far darker than anything I've ever seen. It's not a light-hearted tale, not by any means, and it happened many years ago, but I've never been able to forget it." The room stilled, every eye fixed on her, but Jane hesitated. "The truth is, I wasn't just a bystander, I was caught up in it. But, no regrets, none at all, really. It was something I had to do." "Come now, Miss Marple," Sir Henry urged. "Don't leave us hanging. What is this tragedy?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes narrowing as she leaned forward. "You've heard of St. Mary Mead, haven't you?" she began slowly. "It wasn't there, but I can tell you, the tragedy I'm about to recount will chill your bones and make you question everything you know. For you see, Sir Henry, the story begins not with a loss, but with a secret far older than any of us." As the group gathered around the fire, Sir Henry's voice cut through the murmurs of idle chatter. "A complaint, you say?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. The air was thick with curiosity, yet the gathered party seemed distracted, each lost in their own thoughts. Colonel Bantry sat slouched, glowering at the mantelpiece, as if it held the answers to every question he'd ever had. Mrs. Bantry, ever the proper hostess, was slyly glancing at the latest catalogue of bulbs, clearly more interested in the contents of the post than in what was being said. Dr. Lloyd, the ever-earnest intellectual, was distracted by the presence of the young and striking actress Jane Helia, while the actress herself appeared completely engrossed in her manicured nails. But there, sitting bolt upright as always, was Miss Marple, her quiet faded blue eyes catching Sir Henry's gaze with an unspoken challenge. A complaint indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice calm yet firm. I believe I may be the one to solve this, as it's a mystery I know quite well. Her words hung in the air, drawing the attention of the entire room. The usual light-hearted banter evaporated, replaced by an almost electric silence. Sir Henry leaned forward, intrigued. A mystery, you say? He prodded. What have you got for us, Miss Marple? I don't expect a tale of blood and gore, Sir Henry, Miss Marple replied, her lips curling in a small smile. No, it's something more subtle, something that most would overlook. It's not in St. Mary Mead, but it might as well have been. The room fell quieter as she began her tale, a story not of a single crime, but of a series of events that seemed unconnected at first glance, but held a common thread of suspicion and deceit. It all began with a letter, she continued, her voice growing more assured, a letter that led to an air of secrecy, a tragedy that unfolded quietly, without any of the typical signs, a tragedy with no obvious villain, no clear resolution, yet a mystery that lingered in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. People spoke in whispers, but never to the right people. They kept their secrets, and in doing so, they built the very web that trapped them all. An air of secrecy, Sir Henry mused. This sounds like something worth hearing. Tell me more, Miss Marple. Don't leave us hanging. And with that, Miss Marple began to unravel a tale that would have the entire room on edge, each person slowly realizing that they too might be part of the very mystery she was describing, trapped in a web spun long before they even arrived. It was a story not just of who done it, but of who had the most to lose, and what would remain once the truth came to light. The tension mounted as she spoke, and each listener began to question the people they thought they knew, wondering just how many secrets were being hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. The real question was, could anyone escape the truth once it had been set in motion? As the group gathered around, Miss Marple, with her usual calm, began to recount a peculiar incident that had been lingering in her mind for some time. I've often felt, like many others, the sting of unkind words, she began, her voice steady. But I must tell you about Ethel, a very attractive and obliging girl, you would agree. Yet, from the moment I saw her, I had an unsettling feeling. There was something about her, something that reminded me of other girls who had slipped away unnoticed, leaving destruction in their wake. She was charming, but I knew she could not be trusted, just as I had sensed trouble before. It was a feeling that ran deep, so I made the decision to let her go after a month of service. And though I gave her a glowing reference, I warned old Mrs. Edwards where she was headed next. My nephew Raymond was furious with me, saying I had no right to cast such aspersions without proof. Yet, I could not ignore the signs. Not long after, Ethel had gone to Lady Ashton, and before long the lady's valuable items began to vanish, lace from her undergarments, 2 diamond brooches, until the girl disappeared into the night without a trace. Miss Marple paused, taking a deep breath, her gaze unfaltering, as she looked at Sir Henry, who was watching her with rapt attention. I know you may think this has nothing to do with the events at the Conspar Hydro, but in a way it does. It helps explain why, the moment I saw Mr. Sanders and his wife together, I felt a deep sense of certainty. I knew without any doubt that he meant to harm her. You see, Mr. Sanders was charming, with a robust, hearty demeanor, and he seemed to adore his wife. But I recognized something sinister beneath that charm, just as I had with Ethel. I may have no proof, Sir Henry, but I had the feeling, just as I had with others in the past. I remembered the tragic case of Walter Holes, the innkeeper, whose wife fell into the river, only for him to collect the insurance money, or the poor woman, who despite my warning, went on a holiday to Switzerland with her husband, only to end up in a tragic accident. He's married to another woman now, and yet there was no justice. There was no proof, and that, Sir Henry, is what often haunts me, what we know but can't prove. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened in shock. But Miss Marple, you can't mean, she stammered, her voice trailing off. Yes, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple interrupted gently. It's more common than you might think. Men especially, with their strength and power, are tempted to take the easy route when an accident looks so convincing. I knew from the moment I saw them, Mr. Sanders and his wife, that something would happen. I recall a tram ride, crowded and bustling, when suddenly Mr. Sanders lost his balance and fell against his wife. She tumbled down the stairs, her head crashing first, but miraculously, the conductor, a strong young man, managed to catch her. It was a close call, but the whole thing seemed too convenient. It seemed too rehearsed. The room fell silent, the weight of Miss Marple's words sinking in. Everyone was now wondering, had Miss Marple unraveled another mystery before it even fully began? And if so, who else was hiding their own dark secrets behind charming smiles and carefully curated lives? The accident, of course, appeared to be just that. An accident. Nothing about it could have seemed more accidental, but I knew better. Mr. Sanders, as he had casually mentioned, had served in the merchant navy, and a man who could maintain his balance on a tilting boat surely wouldn't lose it on a tram. But of course, I was an old woman, and what did I know? Sir Henry, I could see skeptical. You're saying you were certain then? He asked. Miss Marple gave a slight nod. I made up my mind the moment I saw them together, but it wasn't just that tram ride. There was another incident, not long after, that confirmed my suspicions. I was sure she was about to be killed. She paused, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. And you may find it hard to believe, Sir Henry, but I couldn't go to the police, warn the young woman. That would have been futile. She was far too in love to listen to reason. Her eyes twinkled briefly before she continued. I had to make my own way, gather my own evidence, and I did just that. It wasn't hard. When you're doing your needlework by the fire, people talk. Mrs. Sanders, Gladys, was particularly willing to share. They'd been married only a short while, and she confided that they were struggling financially. They lived frugally on her small income, while her husband's property, money that could set them up, was tied up for the time being. It was the usual story, one I had heard many times before, of a young couple in love, but burdened by financial woes. Still, the money would be hers to will away, and they had both made wills after their marriage, leaving everything to one another. Such a touching sentiment. If only it had been the whole truth. I learned more, much more. Their living situation was precarious, squeezed into a room at the top of the house, tucked away among the servants. A fire hazard, as you can imagine, though there was a fire escape. I took a particular interest in this. What if there had been no escape? I pressed Mrs. Sanders to promise me something, not to go out on the balcony. I told her I had a dream, one that felt too real to ignore. Sometimes, a little superstition can go a long way. Miss Marple paused, her expression thoughtful. She was a pale, rather delicate woman, easily impressionable, and she believed me, repeating my words to her husband. I noticed his reaction though. He wasn't taken in, and he certainly knew I had been on that tram. No, he wasn't fooled, and that made me terribly uneasy. He was already planning something, and my warnings, I feared, would only delay his intentions. I knew he would wait, but the question was, for how long? The plan, though bold, was to set a trap. I knew that if I could manipulate the situation, if I could somehow coax him into trying to harm her in a way I could predict, he would be unmasked for what he truly was. The young woman would have no choice but to confront the truth, no matter how devastating it might be for her. You take my breath away, Dr. Lloyd exclaimed, clearly astonished by the complexity of the plan. But how could you possibly execute such a thing? I would have found a way, Miss Marple responded confidently, though there was an edge of regret in her voice. But he was too clever for me. He anticipated my every move. He knew I would suspect an accident, so he made sure it was murder, deliberate, calculated. The room fell silent, a shudder running through the listeners as Miss Marple's words sank in. I must admit, she continued, her expression turning grim, I've always felt bitter about it. I should have been able to prevent it, but Providence had its own plan. At least I did what I could. Her tone softened for a moment before she added, there was something undeniably eerie in the air around that time. It was as though misfortune had settled over the place, like a dark cloud. It began with George, the old hall porter, who had worked at the house for years. He'd always been a fixture, someone who knew every corner of the house, and yet, he passed away suddenly from bronchitis and pneumonia, just 4 days before Christmas. It was a terrible blow to everyone, and as if that wasn't enough, one of the housemaids, a sweet girl, developed a septic finger, and within 24 hours, she too was gone. The atmosphere in the house had become heavy, oppressive, and it wasn't long before Mrs. Carpenter, an elderly guest with a morbid streak, began her usual superstitions. "Never 2 without 3, she muttered to anyone who would listen. She was relishing it, almost thrilled by the thought. "There'll be another death, mark my words, you'll see." It was unsettling, the way she spoke, so certain of herself. Miss Marple paused, then continued with a tight-lipped smile. I, of course, dismissed her words as nothing more than the ramblings of an old woman. But then, just as she finished speaking, I looked up, and there he was, Mr. Sanders, standing in the doorway, his face briefly unguarded, his thoughts written all over it. I knew in that instant, I will believe until my dying day, that it was Mrs. Carpenter's cursed words that set the whole thing in motion. I saw the flicker of realization in Mr. Sanders' eyes. He had a plan, and he was already moving forward with it. Miss Marple leaned in, her voice lowering. He entered the room, smiling as if nothing was wrong, asking if any of us needed anything from the shops. He stayed for a minute, laughing, chatting, but the whole time I could see the wheels turning in his mind. After a short while, he left, but my anxiety grew. I had to know, where was Mrs. Sanders? No one seemed to know. Mrs. Trollope mentioned that she had gone out to play bridge with some friends, the Mortimers, and for a moment, I felt a brief sense of relief, but something was still off. I couldn't shake the feeling that danger was lurking. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed with a mix of frustration and determination. It wasn't long after, about half an hour later, that I went to check again, and when I did, I knew something terrible had happened. As I made my way up to my room, I bumped into Dr. Coe, my personal physician, coming down the stairs. I was just about to consult him regarding my ongoing issues with rheumatism, so I invited him into my room. It was then, in a moment of quiet confidentiality, that he mentioned the recent tragic death of young Mary, the housemaid. He said the manager didn't want the news to spread, so he asked me to keep it to myself. Of course, I didn't tell him that it had been the only topic of conversation among us for the last hour, ever since poor Mary had passed away. These things never remain secrets for long, and a man of Dr. Coe's experience should have known that well enough. But Dr. Coe, being a simple and trusting man, always believed the best in people, and that's what unsettled me. Just as he was about to leave, he casually mentioned that Sanders had asked him to check on his wife, Gladys. Apparently, she'd been feeling unwell lately, suffering from indigestion and the like, but just earlier that day, Gladys had told me that she had a perfect digestion, and was thankful for it. The contradiction struck me with alarming clarity. Sanders, I suspected, was setting the stage for something much darker. Before I had time to gather my thoughts or decide whether to speak to him, Sanders himself appeared, descending the stairs dressed to go out. He asked if I needed anything from the town, his usual pleasant demeanor on display. It took all my self-control to remain civil. I hurriedly made my way to the lounge, and ordered tea, still uneasy. I remember the time clearly. It was just before 5:30. Now what happened next is crucial, and I must explain it carefully. I was sitting in the lounge with Miss Trollope when Mr. Sanders came in around 6:45. This time he wasn't alone. 2 other men, a bit tipsy and loud, were with him. Sanders, however, left them behind and approached our table. With his charming smile, he explained that he needed advice on a Christmas present for his wife, a particular evening bag. "You see, ladies," he said, "I'm just a rough salesman. What do I know about such things? I've had 3 bags sent to me on approval, and I want an expert opinion before I choose." We agreed to help him, and at his request followed him upstairs, since he feared his wife might arrive unexpectedly. As we entered the room, something felt wrong. I shall never forget that moment. The door opened with a click, and the light flickered on. Mrs. Sanders was lying on the floor, her body unnaturally still, face down. I rushed to her, kneeling beside her to check for a pulse, but it was too late. The arm was cold stiff. A stocking filled with sand lay beside her head, the weapon that had struck her down. Miss Trollope, utterly useless in her panic, stood by the door, moaning in shock, and then Sanders' agonized cry rang through the room. "My wife! My wife!" His face twisted with grief, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my heart skip a beat. It was too perfect, too staged, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. The scene was unfolding exactly as he had planned. As I knelt beside the lifeless body of Mrs. Sanders, I could feel the tension tightening in the air. Every instinct told me to stop Sanders from touching her. I was certain, in that fleeting moment, that he had committed the murder, and I feared he might try to hide something, perhaps a weapon, or even evidence of his guilt. "Don't touch her," I ordered firmly, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling in my mind. I immediately turned to Miss Trollope, urging her to go downstairs and fetch the manager. "Stay here with me," I told Sanders, not daring to leave him alone in the room with the body, even as his frantic displays of grief began to feel more like a performance than genuine mourning. His face was pale, his hands trembling, and he kept clutching his head, as if struck by an unbearable loss. But the more I observed him, the more I began to wonder, was he acting, or was he genuinely as shattered as he appeared? In that moment, it was impossible to be certain. But one thing was clear: his grief seemed too polished, too rehearsed. The manager arrived swiftly, taking control of the scene with efficiency. He inspected the room, and with a grave look, ordered everyone out, locking the door behind him. He took the key and rushed to the phone to contact the police. As time dragged on, every second seemed to stretch unbearably. The line was out of order, and the manager had to send a messenger to the police station. I could feel my nerves fraying. Mrs. Carpenter, ever the seer, was unreasonably pleased at how quickly her ominous prediction of never two without three had come true. Sanders, meanwhile, wandered around the grounds, visibly agitated, clutching his head and groaning in exaggerated sorrow. Finally the police arrived, bringing with them an air of authority that was both comforting and chilling. They went upstairs with the manager, and soon enough they called for me. I followed them upstairs to the room, where the inspector was waiting. He was an intelligent-looking man with sharp eyes and a composed manner. "Miss Jane Marple," he said, his tone respectful but probing, "I understand you were present when the body was discovered." I nodded and recounted everything as it happened, calmly, precisely, leaving no detail unspoken. I could sense the inspector's relief, as my clear account was a stark contrast to the frantic ramblings of Sanders and the utterly demoralized Miss Trollope. I recalled my mother's lessons on grace and composure in public, no matter the circumstances, and I felt a certain pride in being able to maintain my clarity under pressure. When I finished, the inspector seemed satisfied, but remained cautious. "Thank you, madam," he said, before adding, "Now, if you don't mind, could you please look at the body once more? Is this exactly the position in which it was found?" I was momentarily confused. "Yes," I answered firmly, "the body hasn't been moved." I stopped Mr. Sanders from touching her. The inspector nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on me with a faint trace of approval. "The gentleman seems terribly upset," he remarked, his voice neutral. "He does," I replied, choosing not to comment further on the depth of his apparent distress. But the inspector's sharp eyes didn't miss a thing. He looked at me closely, and his next question made my heart skip a beat. "So we can be sure the body is exactly as it was when found?" I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then replied, "Except for the hat." The inspector's gaze snapped up to mine, his eyes narrowing in sudden suspicion. "The hat?" he asked, a slight edge creeping into his voice. I nodded. "Yes, the hat. It wasn't there when we first arrived." The tension in the room thickened, and I could almost feel the weight of the inspector's scrutiny as he processed this new detail. What had seemed like a simple case of an untimely death now felt like a much darker puzzle, and I had no idea how deep the deception truly ran. The moment the inspector mentioned the hat, my heart sank. It had once rested neatly atop Gladys's head, yet now it lay discarded beside her, as though someone had carelessly knocked it off in haste. At first I assumed that the police had inadvertently disturbed the scene, but the inspector was quick to deny it. "Nothing has been touched, madam," he assured me, his voice unwavering. His eyes remained fixed on Gladys's prone body, a deep frown creasing his forehead. Her attire seemed oddly mismatched for someone who had been at home, an old dark red tweed coat with a grey fur collar, and beneath it, the cheap red felt hat. As I studied the scene, I recalled something peculiar. There had been a glint of pearls visible beneath the brim of her hat when I first looked at her. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, with the inspector's question in mind, I could confirm there had indeed been earrings, simple delicate pearls, dangling from her ears. The inspector's eyes brightened at this confirmation. "That settles it," he muttered, more to himself than to me. The lady's jewel case was rifled through, the rings were taken from her fingers, and the murderer must have overlooked the earrings. They probably came back for them after the discovery of the body. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room slowly. "A cool customer, this one," he added, his voice low and contemplative. I couldn't help but agree, but the mystery deepened with his next thought. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the murderer was hiding in this room all along." A chill ran through me as he spoke. Could it be that someone had been concealed here, watching us? I quickly dismissed the idea. "I looked under the bed," I replied, trying to sound calm, "and the manager opened the wardrobe doors. There was nowhere else a person could have hidden." I watched as the inspector nodded, seemingly satisfied, though his eyes still danced with uncertainty. "The wardrobe, yes, it's shallow," he agreed, "but the hat cupboard was locked." He thought for a moment, then added, "No one could have been hidden there." His gaze shifted back to me. "I'll take your word for it, madam," he said, though the doubt still lingered in his voice. "But as I said before, the murderer must have been a very cool customer. The manager locked the door, and took the key, so the only way the thief could have gotten out was through the balcony, or the fire escape. That's how he got away." I felt a shiver of realization. "You may have disturbed him," the inspector added. "He slipped out the window while you were all downstairs, then came back once you had all left." I stood still for a moment, trying to process the implications of his words. "Are you sure there was a thief?" I asked, still uncertain. "Well," the inspector replied dryly, "it looks like it, doesn't it?" There was something in his tone, something in the way he said it, that left me convinced he wasn't about to buy Sanders's act as the devastated widower. My mind raced, torn between suspicion and the nagging feeling that I was missing something crucial. I had my doubts about Sanders, there was no denying that. I had been certain that he had orchestrated his wife's death, and yet, this strange, almost absurd series of events began to make me question everything. Deep down, I knew the man was a scoundrel, pretending to be overcome with grief, when all I could see was the smug satisfaction hidden behind his sorrowful mask. His grief, so carefully practiced, didn't fool me for a second, but as I stood there, caught in this web of contradictions and coincidences, I realized that something far more sinister was at play. My belief in Sanders's guilt remained unshaken, yet I could no longer ignore the unsettling feeling that perhaps there was more to this case than I had initially thought. As the inspector spoke, I could feel a wave of confusion washing over me, a gnawing sense of doubt that clung to my every thought. Sanders, a man of precision, of calculated decisions, didn't fit the mold of a murderer. His actions, though odd, had always been reasonable, even predictable. And yet, here I was, trying to reconcile the logical man I knew with the monster that could have done something as senseless as returning to the scene of his crime to retrieve a pair of earrings. It was completely irrational. Why would he risk everything for such a trivial act? The more I thought about it, the more the notion that Sanders could be the culprit seemed impossible. I had been so certain of his guilt, so convinced of his capacity for cruelty, but suddenly, everything I believed felt like shifting sand. The idea that he had crept back to the house through the fire escape just to take the earrings didn't make sense, not for a man so pragmatic, so methodical. No, this was not the Sanders I had come to understand. This was something different. It was a realization that hit me hard, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being blind to something obvious, something that had been right under my nose. Miss Marple, watching me closely, seemed to understand the turmoil that gripped my mind. She gave me a knowing look before she continued, her voice steady and filled with an unexpected wisdom. "You see," she began, It's often the unexpected that catches us off guard. I was sure, just as you were, that Mr. Sanders was guilty, but as the facts unfolded, they proved something entirely different. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, all I could do was listen, absorbing the weight of her statement. Mrs. Bantry, who had been listening intently, gasped in shock. Miss Marple turned to her with a gentle smile. "I know, my dear, this is not what you were expecting when I started this tale, nor was it what I expected, but as the facts show, if one is proven wrong, one must accept it, and begin anew." The truth was undeniable now. Sanders, for all his faults, could not have been the murderer. The evidence was conclusive, and it had been staring me in the face all along. As Miss Marple spoke, I could feel the pieces of the puzzle coming together. "Mrs. Sanders," she continued, "spent the afternoon playing bridge with friends, the Mortimers. She left their house around 4:30 or 5 o'clock, and by 6 o'clock, she must have been at the Hydro. No one saw her enter, so she must have gone through the side door and straight to her room. She changed out of her coat and skirt, which were later found hanging in the wardrobe. She was preparing to leave again when the fatal blow was struck. It's likely she never saw her attacker. The sandbag, I understand, is a most effective weapon for such a crime." Miss Marple paused, letting her words sink in, then went on. "It's clear the attacker was hiding in the room, perhaps in one of the wardrobe cupboards she hadn't opened. Now as for Mr. Sanders, his whereabouts were accounted for. He left around 5:30, did some shopping, and by 6 o'clock, he was at the Grand Spa Hotel. There he met two friends, Hitchcock and Spender, with whom he spent the evening. They played billiards, and had quite a few whiskies and sodas. These two men were with him the entire time, all the way back to the Hydro, and he only left them to come across to me and Miss Marple around 6:45. At that moment, his wife had already been murdered." The implications of Miss Marple's words were clear now. There was no way Sanders could have committed the crime. The timeline didn't align, but what did it mean? The shock of the twist, of the realization that the obvious culprit wasn't the one responsible, left me reeling. And yet, in the pit of my stomach, I knew that this was just the beginning. The real mystery, the true depth of the crime, was only just starting to unfold. As I continued to investigate, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered with me. I had spoken with Sanders' two friends, men I found absolutely unpleasant, lacking both charm and decency. Yet, despite their repulsive nature, I was certain of one thing: they were telling the truth. They had been with Sanders the entire time, as they had claimed. There was one small but curious detail that caught my attention though. During the bridge game, Mrs. Sanders had been called to the phone. The caller was a Mr. Littleworth, someone I had never heard of before. She seemed almost giddy upon hearing his voice, her mood lightening in a way that didn't fit the context of the situation. She made several mistakes in her game that evening, which was unlike her, and she left earlier than expected, much to her friend's surprise. When Mr. Sanders was asked about Littleworth, he insisted that he didn't know anyone by that name. His wife, too, seemed unfamiliar with the name. Yet, after the call, she returned with a strange blush on her cheeks, her demeanor markedly different. It suggested that whoever this Littleworth person was, they hadn't given their real name, an unsettling detail, don't you think? This introduced a troubling theory. Was Mrs. Sanders preparing to meet someone, perhaps the mysterious Mr. Littleworth? Did that person enter her room via the fire escape, catching her off guard and attacking her in cold blood? The thought sent chills down my spine, but the pieces didn't fit perfectly, and I still wasn't sure of what I was missing. As the conversation progressed, Sir Henry's voice broke the silence. "So what's the answer then?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Mrs. Bantry, clearly uncomfortable with the ambiguity of it all, shrugged. "I'm no good at guessing," she confessed, her tone apologetic. Miss Marple, however, looked at her with a smile that seemed to suggest she was far ahead of all of us. She didn't rush to explain though. Instead she paused, and said something that caught my attention. Why was the hat cupboard locked? Her question hung in the air, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for her sharp mind. Mrs. Bantry seemed taken aback, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. "Oh, how clever of you, my dear," Miss Marple continued, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "That's exactly what I wondered, and it's the key to everything." The cupboard in question held nothing more than a pair of embroidered slippers and some handkerchiefs, a seemingly trivial detail. But Miss Marple's mind worked in a way that made even the simplest things appear important. The key to the cupboard had been found in Mrs. Sanders' handbag, which should have been an innocuous discovery, but there was more beneath the surface. "Is that it?" Jane asked, her voice tinged with disappointment. Miss Marple didn't share her sense of letdown. "Oh, but it is," she insisted, a grin tugging at the corner of her lips. "This is the one thing that made everything unravel. It's the one thing that ruined the murderous plans." The room went quiet, everyone's attention now completely fixed on Miss Marple. "I didn't see it at first," she admitted. "For 2 whole days, I was completely stumped. Then it hit me. I went to the inspector and asked him to try something." At this point, we were all on the edge of our seats, waiting for the inevitable revelation. "What did you ask him to try?" I couldn't help but ask. Miss Marple paused dramatically, before continuing. "I asked him to put the hat on the poor girl's head," she said, her voice dropping slightly.
"Then of course, he couldn't."
"It wouldn't fit. The hat didn't belong to her." A stunned silence fell over us, as the implication of her words sank in. "But it was on her head," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice trembling with confusion. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, my dear. It was never on her head." The twist was like a cold slap to the face. It wasn't her hat at all, and in that moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew was wrong. The truth was much darker, much more twisted than I could have imagined. The murderer's plan had hinged on something as simple as a hat, but that small overlooked detail had been the key to unraveling the entire mystery. The truth was finally within reach. As Miss Marple continued to speak, her voice held a chilling clarity, weaving a tapestry of deception, desperation, and calculated risk. "You see," she began, her tone grave, "we were all so certain it was Gladys. The body was lying there, its face hidden by the hat, and we never truly examined it. But when I thought about it later, it became clear. The moment we were calling the police, Gladys Sanders was still alive. The corpse we thought was hers was a ruse, someone else entirely. But who could pull off such an elaborate scheme?" She paused, letting the weight of the revelation sink in before continuing. "It was a wicked idea, but a brilliant one. He swapped bodies. The poor housemaid, Mary, became his pawn in this grim game. He knew no one would miss her immediately, so he took her body, dressed it in Gladys's clothes, and used it to stage a crime scene. The locked cupboard, it was just a distraction, and the hat, oh the hat, was the critical piece of evidence. It didn't fit because it wasn't Gladys's. The poor girl's own hair, neatly shingled, didn't match Gladys's thick bun. He never counted on that detail slipping through, but there it was. When he returned, he pretended to find the body and orchestrated the investigation, ensuring no one suspected him. And after his wife left the bridge party early, as he had arranged with his fake identity, he took her up the fire escape. She had no idea what was truly unfolding. He had convinced her to meet him near the fire escape, promising a surprise, but what awaited her was far more sinister. The brutal end of a life, followed by the sickening process of dressing her in the body of the poor maid. Yet, despite all his planning, there was one detail that went awry. Mary's hat didn't fit, and that was the clue I needed. But the risk he took, meeting his wife under false pretenses, leading her into that trap, it was all too perfect, too dangerous, and still, he managed to escape detection, until now. The revelation sent a cold shiver through the room, as the truth unfolded like a dark tapestry of betrayal, murder, and a chillingly calculated mind. The room grew heavier with each passing moment as Miss Marple recounted the grim details, her voice calm yet laced with a quiet intensity. "The body was a masterstroke of deception," she said, "a piece of meticulous work, yet it had its flaws. He couldn't risk the police arriving too soon, for the brief window of time between death and discovery could expose the lie. The body had been staged, crafted to look like the victim had been dead for hours, when in reality, it was only a matter of minutes." Her gaze shifted to the group, the weight of her words settling into their minds. "When the police arrived, they wasted time in the manager's office, an innocuous delay that worked in his favor. He knew exactly what to count on: the inexperience of the first responders, no one with expertise to notice the difference between a body that had been dead for 2 hours versus one that had only been dead for half an hour. Dr. Lloyd nodded thoughtfully. By the time the police surgeon examined the body, it would have been after 7, maybe even closer to past, but he couldn't possibly tell when the murder actually occurred. Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering.
I should have known.
When I touched the poor girl's hand, it was icy cold, an unmistakable sign that she had been dead for a while. Yet, when the inspector spoke, he confidently suggested that the murder had happened just moments before we arrived. Everyone bought into it. Sir Henry looked at Miss Marple, his respect for her deepening.
You saw more than you let on,
Didn't you? She nodded slowly, her face hardening with the weight of regret. Yes, and I've never forgiven myself for not acting sooner. The man responsible was hanged, and it was the right thing to do, but I've often wondered if I could have saved that poor girl. Who would have listened to an old woman though making rash assumptions? Her gaze softened slightly as she sighed. Perhaps, in the end, it was better for her to die before she had to face the truth. Before she had to live in a world where the man she loved would be nothing more than a monster. Her eyes moved toward Jane here, the renowned beauty and successful actress who stood before her, seemingly unaffected by the chilling conversation. You understand, don't you? Miss Marple asked softly. Jane's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly masked her emotion, a brief glimpse of vulnerability flickering in her eyes. Miss Marple nodded knowingly. I see, my dear.
I see.
The silence that followed was heavy, as the room seemed to hold its breath, gripped by the weight of the unsolved past and the haunting present.